Before I call the Chancellor, it may help the House if I set out how proceedings on the autumn statement will unfold. Once the Chancellor has delivered his statement, copies of the resolutions relating to the statement will be made available in the Vote Office and online. I will then call the Shadow Chancellor and other honourable members to ask questions. This will follow the usual pattern for a ministerial statement. At the end of questions on the statement, the Chancellor will be called to move a motion under Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968. The question on this motion must be put without debate. We will then proceed to do the debate on the autumn statement resolutions. A minister will move the first of the resolutions and open the debate. Debate will take place over 3 days, concluding on Monday. At the end of the debate on Monday, the question on the first of the resolutions will be disposed of, and the questions on the remaining resolutions will then be taken formally without further debate. I now call the Chancellor to make the autumn statement.
Mr. Speaker, I come today with good news. It's my wife's birthday, and unlike me, she's looking younger every year. I turn to the statement. After a global pandemic and energy crisis, we have taken difficult decisions to put our economy back on track. We've supported families with rising bills, cut borrowing and halved inflation. Rather than a recession, the economy has grown. Rather than falling as predicted, real incomes have risen. Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done. Others proposed a more short-term approach, but we have not made unaffordable pay offers to the unions. We have not stopped new oil and gas exploration, and we have not increased borrowing by £28 billion a year. That would have pushed inflation up just when we need to bring it down. Instead, under this Prime Minister, we take decisions for the long term. In today's autumn statement for growth, our choice is not big government, high spending and high tax, because we know that leads to less growth, not more. Instead, we reduce debt, cut taxes and reward work. We deliver world-class education. We build domestic sustainable energy, and we back British business with 110 growth measures. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all, but well, I will if you like. But in summary, Mr. Speaker, they remove planning red tape, they speed up access to the national grid, they support entrepreneurs raising capital, they get behind our fastest growing industries, they unlock foreign direct investment, they boost productivity, they reform welfare, they level up opportunity to every corner of the country, and they cut business taxes. The Office for Budget Responsibility say that the combined impact of these measures will raise business investment, get more people into work, reduce inflation next year and increase GDP. But Conservatives also know that a dynamic economy depends on the energy and enterprise of people more than any diktats or decisions by ministers. So today's measures do not just remove barriers to investment, they reward effort and work. And I'll go through the measures in three parts. In the first, I'll use updated OBR forecasts to show the progress we're making against the Prime Minister's economic priorities. The second part sets out growth measures to back British business. Finally, I conclude with measures to make work pay. Before I start with the forecasts, I want to express my horror at the murderous attack on Israeli citizens on October the 7th and the subsequent loss of life on both sides. I will remember for the rest of my life, as I know many other honourable members will, being taken to Auschwitz by Rabbi Barry Marcus and the remarkable Holocaust Educational Trust. But I'm deeply concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in our country. So I'm announcing up to £7 million over the next 3 years for organisations like the Holocaust Education Trust to tackle anti-Semitism in schools and universities. I will also repeat the £3 million uplift to the Community Security Trust. When it comes to anti-Semitism and all forms of racism, we must never allow the clock to be turned back. I now move on to the OBR's economic and fiscal forecasts, and I thank Richard Hughes and his team for their sterling work in preparing them. 3 of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's 5 pledges at the start of the year were economic: to halve inflation, grow the economy and reduce debt. Today I can report to the House that we are delivering on all 3. Let's start with inflation. Now, the Shadow Chancellor didn't mention it in her conference speech. My conference speech was before hers, so all she had to do was a bit of copying and pasting, which I've heard she's good at. But it speaks volumes that during the worst global inflation shock for a generation, it didn't even get a mention. Well, if controlling inflation isn't a priority for Labour, it is for us. When the Prime Minister and I took office, inflation was 11.1%. Last week it fell to 4.6%. We promised to halve inflation and we have halved it. Core inflation is now lower than in nearly half the economies in the EU, and the OBR say that headline inflation will fall to 2.8% by the end of 2024 before falling to the 2% target in 2025. I will not take risks with inflation, and the OBR confirm that the measures I take today make inflation lower next year than it would otherwise have been. I thank the Independent Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee for their crucial role in bringing inflation down, and we will continue to back them to do whatever it takes until the job is done. But as we do, we will continue to support families in difficulty. And today I add 4 further measures to help with the cost of living. Firstly, for those on the lowest incomes, I understand the concerns some have about the effect on work incentives of matching benefit increases to inflation. I know there's been some speculation that we would increase benefits next year by the lower October figure for inflation, but cost of living pressures remain at their most acute for the poorest families. So instead, the government has decided to increase universal credit and other benefits from next April by 6.7% in line with September's inflation figure, an average increase of £470 for 5.5 million households next year. Vital support to those on the very lowest incomes from a compassionate Conservative government. Second, because rent can constitute more than half the living costs of private renters on the lowest incomes, I've listened closely to many colleagues, as well as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation, Citizens Advice UK and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who said that unfreezing the local housing allowance was an urgent priority. I will therefore increase the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile of local market rents. This will give 1.6 million households an average of £800 of support next year. Third, although I'm going to increase duty on hand-rolling tobacco by an additional 10% above the tobacco duty escalator, I know that for many people, going to the pub has become more expensive. I've listened closely to the persuasive arguments on alcohol duties from my honourable friend for Murray and my right honourable friend for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedsdale, fierce champions of the Scotch whisky industry. I've also listened to defenders of the great British pint, such as my right honourable friends for the Vale of Glamorgan and Buckingham, in my own constituency to Councillor Jane Austen, who is a big supporter of the Jolly Farmer pub in Bramley, and indeed to the Sun newspaper. So, as well as confirming our Brexit pubs guarantee, which means the duty on a pint is always lower than in the shops, I have decided to freeze all alcohol duty until August the 1st next year. That means no increase in duty on beer, cider, wine or spirits. Finally, pensioners. The triple lock has helped lift 250,000 older people out of poverty since it was instituted by a Conservative government in 2011. It's been a lifeline for many during a period of high inflation. There have been reports that we would uprate it by a lower amount to smooth out the effect of high public sector bonuses in July, but that would have been particularly difficult for 1 million pensioners whose only income is from the state. So instead, today we honour our commitment to the triple lock in full. From April 24, we will increase the full new state pension by 8.5% to £221.20 a week, worth up to £900 more a year. This is one of the largest ever cash increases to the state pension, showing a Conservative government will always back our pensioners. Including today's measures, our total commitment to easing cost of living pressures has risen to £104 billion. That includes paying around half the cost of the average energy bill since last October, and amounts now to an average of £3,700 per household. We are able to do that only because we reduced the deficit by 80% ahead of the pandemic, which the party opposite might reflect on, having opposed us every step of the way. Next, I turn to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's pledge to reduce debt. Before I took difficult decisions in last year's autumn statement, debt was predicted to rise to almost 100% of GDP by the end of the forecast. Since then, the economy has outperformed expectations, and I've taken difficult decisions to reduce borrowing. As a result, headline debt is now predicted to be 94% of GDP by the end of the forecast. The OBR today forecast underlying debt will be 91.6% of GDP next year, 92.7% in 24-5, 93.2% in 26-7, before declining in the final 2 years of the forecast to 92.8% in 28-29. That is lower in every year compared to forecasts in the spring. We therefore meet our fiscal rule to have underlying debt falling as a percentage of GDP in the final year of the forecast, with double the headroom compared to the OBR's March forecast. And we will continue to have the second lowest government debt in the G7, lower than the United States, Canada, France, Italy or Japan. I turn to borrowing. The Right Honourable Lady opposite said when it comes to borrowing, she will take it up to £28 billion a year. Take it up, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, she has opposed every decision we have made to reduce our borrowing. But, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House will bring borrowing down because, as the late Lord Lawson said, borrowing is just a deferred tax on future generations. Now, I see the Leader of the Opposition shaking his head. In fact, we do have something in common. Both he and I wanted to make a Jeremy Prime Minister. In fairness, his party and mine are probably equally relieved we failed. But whereas this Jeremy is growing the economy, his Jeremy would have crashed it. And the numbers... And the numbers show the contrast. According to the OBR, borrowing is lower this year and next, and on average across the forecast by 0.7 billion every year compared to the spring budget forecast. It falls from 4.5% of GDP in 23-4 to 3%, 2.7%, 2.3%, 1.6% and 1.1% in 28-29. That means we also meet our second fiscal rule, that public sector borrowing must be below 3% of GDP, not just by the final year, but in almost every year of the forecast. Some of this improvement is from higher tax receipts from a stronger economy, but we also maintain a disciplined approach to public spending. As I set out in the spring budget, resource spending will increase by 1% a year from 25-6 in real terms, and we are sustaining the record 2020 increase in capital spending in cash terms until the end of the forecast. Within this, we will meet our NATO commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence, critical at a time of global threats to the international order, most notably from Putin's evil war in Ukraine. We also support a group of people to whom we owe our freedom, our brave veterans. I will extend national insurance relief for employers of eligible veterans for a further year and provide £10 million to support the Veterans, Places, Pathways and People programme, and I thank our excellent Veterans Minister for his championing of their cause. We have shown that we are prepared to increase funding for vital public services, with record numbers of police officers, doctors, nurses and teachers. We're nearly doubling the numbers of doctors and nurses we train, having given the NHS its first ever long-term workforce plan, as I promised to do a year ago. We're also tackling the biggest single preventable cause of mortality the NHS has to deal with by bringing forward plans for a smoke-free generation. But alongside extra funding and support, we need to see reform. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. And that is why I want the public sector to increase productivity growth by at least 0.5% a year, the level at which the size of our state starts to reduce as a proportion of GDP. I've already announced plans to cap and reduce the size of the civil service to pre-pandemic levels. Today, I pay tribute to my friend, the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury, who started our brilliant public sector productivity programme. It will now be pursued by his formidable successor, the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks, who has already been with me to meet police, fire and ambulance personnel to understand why bureaucracy is holding them back. And through this vital work, we will ensure that over time, the growth in public spending is lower than the growth in the economy, whilst always protecting the services the public value. And I will also provide HMRC with the resources they need to ensure everyone pays the tax they owe, raising an additional £5 billion across the forecast period. My right honourable friend also promised to grow the economy. Since 2010, despite inheriting what was then the worst recession since the Second World War, Conservative administrations have presided over faster growth than many of our major competitors, including Spain, Italy, France. Well, they don't like to hear this, but let me tell them the list. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, Germany, Japan. We've grown faster than all of them since 2010. But all those countries have faced a pandemic and an energy shock, and as a result, last autumn, the OBR forecast a recession in which the economy was forecast to shrink by 1.4% this year. Instead, it grew. In fact, it's grown faster than the euro area. Revised numbers from the ONS now say the economy is 1.8% larger than pre-pandemic. And looking ahead, the OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.6% this year and 0.7% next. After that, growth rises to 1.4% in 25, then 1.9%, 2% and 1.7% in 28. If we want those numbers to be higher, we need higher productivity. The private sector is more productive in countries like the United States, Germany and France because it invests more, on average 2 percentage points more of GDP every year. The 110 measures I take today help close that gap by boosting business investment by £20 billion a year. They do not involve borrowing more and ramping up debt, as some advocate. Instead, they unlock investment with supply-side reforms that back British business in the following areas. First, skills. No economy can prosper without investing in the potential of its people. Despite strong opposition, we took difficult decisions to reform our schools. England's 9 to 10-year-olds are now the 4th best readers in the world. And since 2015, our 15 to 16-year-olds have risen 7 places in the OECD rankings for maths, not least thanks to the efforts of the brilliant Right Honourable Member for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton. But 9 million adults in England still have low basic literacy or numeracy skills. So last month, the Prime Minister set out the new Advanced British Standard to ensure all school leavers reach minimum standards in maths and English. And while the party opposite wants to reduce the number of apprentices, we want to increase them. So, following engagement with Make UK and others, I'm announcing a further £50 million of funding over the next 2 years to pilot ways to increase the number of apprentices in engineering and other key growth sectors where there are shortages. Next, planning. It takes too long. There's 110 of these measures, so just be patient, folks. I move on to planning. It takes too long to approve infrastructure projects and business planning applications. Many businesses say they would be willing to pay more if they knew their application would be approved faster. So from next year, working with the Community Secretary, I will reform the system to allow local authorities to recover the full costs of major business planning applications in return for being required to meet guaranteed faster timelines. If they fail, fees will be refunded automatically, with the application being processed free of charge. A prompt service or your money back, just as would be the case in the private sector. Now, many planning applications are for house building. The Leader of the Opposition told us he wanted to be a builder, not a blocker. It didn't last long. Just a few months later, Labour blocked reforms to the rules on nutrient neutrality, shamelessly preventing 100,000 houses from being built. Conservatives, on the other hand, are the builders, with more homes being completed in 21-22 than any single year of the last Labour government. And today we take further decisions to unlock the building of more homes. We'll invest £110 million over this year and next to deliver high-quality nutrient mitigation schemes, unlocking 40,000 homes. We'll invest £32 million to bust the planning backlog and develop fantastic new housing quarters in Cambridge, London and Leeds, which will lead to many thousands of additional dwellings. We'll allocate £450 million to the Local Authority Housing Fund to deliver 2,400 new homes, and we'll consult on a new permitted development right to allow any house to be converted into 2 flats, provided the exterior remains unaffected. It's also taking too long for clean energy businesses to access the electricity grid. So after talking to businesses such as National Grid, Octopus Energy and SSE, we today publish our full response to the Windsor Review and Connections Action Plan. These measures will cut grid access delays by 90% and offer up to £10,000 off electricity bills over 10 years for those living closest to new transmission infrastructure. Taken together, these planning and grid reforms are estimated to accelerate around £90 billion of additional business investment over the next 10 years. Next, foreign direct investment. I'm extremely grateful to Lord Harrington for his excellent report on how to increase foreign direct investment. We accept all his headline recommendations, and in particular will put in place a concierge service for large international investors, modelled on the best such services offered by our competitors, and will increase funding for the Office for Investment to deliver it. I now turn to reforms to pension funds that will increase the flow of capital going to our most promising growth companies in a way that also improves outcomes for savers. I'll take forward my Mansion House reforms, starting with measures to consolidate the industry. By 2030, the majority of workplace DC savers will have their pension pots managed in schemes over £30 billion, and by 2040, all local government pension funds will be invested in pools of £200 billion or more. I'll support the establishment of investment vehicles for pension funds to use, including through the LIFTS competition, a new growth fund run by the British Business Bank, and opening the PPF as an investment vehicle for smaller DB pension schemes. I will also consult on giving savers a legal right to require a new employer to pay pension contributions into their existing pension pot if they choose, meaning people can move to having one pension pot for life. These reforms could unlock an extra £75 billion of financing for high-growth companies by 2030 and provide an extra £1,000 a year in retirement for an average earner saving from 18. Alongside this, I'm also proposing further capital market reforms to boost the attractiveness of our markets and make sure the UK remains one of the most attractive places to start, grow and list a company. And as part of this, I will explore options for a NatWest retail share offer in the next 12 months, subject to market conditions and achieving value for money. It's time to get Sid investing again. Yeah. Next, I move on to measures to support our most innovative industries. In the last decade, under Conservatives, we have grown to become the third largest technology sector in the world, double the size of Germany, 3 times the size of France, the biggest life science industry in Europe, Europe's third largest generator of renewable electricity after Germany and Norway, and the 8th largest manufacturer in the world. When it comes to tech, we know that AI will be at the heart of any future growth. I want to make sure our universities, scientists, and startups can access the compute power they need. So, building on the success of the supercomputing centres in Edinburgh and Bristol, I'll invest a further £500 million over the next 2 years to fund further innovation centres to help make us an AI powerhouse. Our creative industries already support Europe's largest film and TV sector. This year's all-Californian blockbuster Barbie was filmed in the constituency of the Honourable Member for Watford, where, of course, the sun always shines. I know that even more could be invested in visual effects if we increase the generosity of the film and high-end TV tax credits, so I'll today launch a call for evidence on how to make that happen. British-discovered vaccines and treatments saved more lives across the world during the pandemic than those from any other country, and I'm incredibly proud of our life sciences industry. To further support research and development, I'm creating a new simplified R&D tax relief, combining the existing R&D expenditure credit and SME schemes. I'll also reduce the rate at which loss-making companies are taxed within the merged scheme from 25% to 19%, and lower the threshold for the additional support for R&D-intensive loss-making SMEs that I announced in the spring to 30%, benefiting a further 5,000 SMEs. And because 2028 marks the centenary of the invention of penicillin by Alexander Fleming, I'm giving £5 million to Imperial College and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust to set up a Fleming Centre to inspire the next generation of world-changing innovations. For our advanced manufacturing and green energy sectors, international investors say the biggest thing we could do is to announce a longer-term strategy for their industries. So with the Secretaries of State for Business and Trade and Energy Security and Net Zero, I'm today publishing those plans. I confirm that we'll make available £4.5 billion of support over the 5 years to 2030 to attract investment into strategic manufacturing sectors. That includes support of £2 billion for zero-emission investments in the automotive sector, something that's been warmly welcomed by Nissan and Toyota, £975 million for aerospace, building on decades of success from firms like Airbus and Rolls-Royce, and £520 million for life sciences to build on the strength of world-class British pharma companies like AstraZeneca and GSK. We'll also provide £960 million for the new Green Industries Growth Accelerator focused on offshore wind, electricity networks, nuclear, CCUS and hydrogen. These targeted investments will ensure the UK remains competitive in sectors where we're already leaders and innovative in sectors where we're not. And taken together across our fastest growing innovation sectors, This support will attract an estimated £2 billion of additional investment every year over the next decade. One of the reasons we support our manufacturing and clean energy sectors is they help to level up growth across the United Kingdom. So I now turn to further levelling up measures. In the spring, I announced we'd deliver 12 new investment zones, 12 mini Canary Wharfs, where government, industry and research institutes collaborate across the UK. Since then, the Exchequer Secretary, the Honourable Member for Grantham and Stamford, has done outstanding work across government to bring this vision to fruition. Following tenacious representations by the Honourable Member for Innis Mon, without whom a mention would mean that no Chancellor's speech was complete, and representations from the unstoppable Mayor of Tees Valley, I have today decided to extend the financial incentives for investment zones and the tax reliefs for free ports from 5 years to 10 years. I will also set up a £150 million investment opportunity fund to catalyse investment into the programme. Now, on Monday, I confirmed a new investment zone in West Yorkshire. Today, having listened to representations from the West Midlands Salesman-in-Chief Andy Street, as well as the Honourable Member for Mansfield and the Honourable Member for Bury North, I am announcing 3 further investment zones focused on advanced manufacturing in the West Midlands, East Midlands and Greater Manchester. Together, local partners expect these will help catalyse over £3 billion of private investment and 65,000 new jobs. And having listened to the Honourable Member for Wrexham and the Honourable Member for Clwyd South, I can announce a second investment zone in Wales in the fantastic region of Wrexham and Flintshire, which I will visit tomorrow. We're publishing new devolution deals with 4 areas, including Hull and East Yorkshire, and offering devolved powers to even more county areas. One of those areas will be the leafiest and most charming county in the country, namely Surrey, where, of course, the Leader of the Opposition grew up. We don't get everything right. On Monday, we saw the announcement of £1 billion of funding through round 3 of the Levelling Up Fund, supporting projects following the campaigning efforts of the members for Keighley, Dewsbury, Doncaster, Scunthorpe, and, of course, Mr. Speaker, Chorley. I can also confirm that we will proceed with over £50 million of funding for high-quality regeneration projects in communities such as Bolsover, Monmouthshire, Warrington and Eden Valley, all of which have particularly effective local MPs as their champions. And because we are proudly the Conservative and Unionist Party, I'm announcing £80 million for the new Levelling Up partnerships in Scotland, £500,000 to support the Hay Festival in Wales, and £3 million of additional funding to support the successful Tackling Paramilitarism programme in Northern Ireland. Next, small business. I ran my own one for 14 years, and I've always known that every big business was a small business once. The Federation of Small Businesses say the biggest thing I could do to help their members is end the scourge of late payments. The Procurement Act we've passed means that the 30-day payment terms, which are already set for public sector contracts, will automatically apply throughout the subcontract supply chain. But from April 24, I'll also introduce a condition that any company bidding for large government contracts should demonstrate they pay their own invoices within an average of 55 days, which will reduce progressively to 30 days. Any small business will also tell you the biggest frustration they have is the tax you pay before making a penny of profit, not least business rates. Now, the government has already taken a third of properties out of rates completely through small business rates relief. We've frozen the tax rate for the last 3 years at a cost of £14.5 billion. We've removed downwards caps from transitional relief, And for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, we've introduced a one-year 75% discount on business rates up to £110,000. And those measures have saved the average independent shop over £20,000. It's not possible to continue with temporary support measures forever. But whilst the standard multiplier, which applies to high-value properties, will rise in line with inflation, I have today decided that we will freeze the small business multiplier for a further year. And following extensive discussions with the FSB and many colleagues in this House, I've also decided to extend the 75% business rates discount for retail, hospitality and leisure for another year. This will save the average independent pub over £12,800 next year, and at a cost of £4.3 billion is a large tax cut which recognises the role of pubs and high street shops in our communities. I thank the members for Stockton South, Barrow and Furness and East Devon for their tenacious campaigning on this issue. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I turn to the smallest of all businesses, those run by the self-employed. These are the people who literally kept our country running during the pandemic. The plumbers who fixed our boilers in lockdowns, the delivery drivers who bought us our shopping, the farmers who kept food on our plates. As part of our plans to grow the economy, I want to reform and simplify taxes paid by the self-employed. So today I'm announcing a major reform of one of those taxes. It's one most people haven't heard of, but it's a big deal for those who have to pay it. Class 2 national insurance is a flat rate, compulsory charge, currently £3.45 a week, paid by self-employed people earning more than £12,570, which gives state pension entitlement. Today, after careful consideration, and in recognition of the contribution made by self-employed people to our country, I can announce that we are abolishing Class 2 national insurance altogether, saving the average self-employed person £192 a year. Access to entitlements and credits will be maintained in full, and those who choose to pay voluntarily will still be able to do so. But this change simplifies and cuts tax for nearly 2 million self-employed people, whilst protecting the interest of those on the lowest pay. And because we value their work, I'm taking one further step for the self-employed. They also pay Class 4 national insurance at 9% on all earnings between £12,570 and £50,270. Today, I've decided to cut that tax by 1 percentage point to 8% from April. Taken together with the abolition of the compulsory Class 2 charge, these reforms will save around 2 million self-employed people an average of £350 a year from April. Mr. Speaker, we're backing small business by freezing their business rates, extending retail, hospitality and leisure relief, abolishing compulsory Class 2 national insurance payments and reducing Class 4 national insurance by 1 percentage point in today's autumn statement for growth. Small businesses work so hard for us, and a Conservative government today is working hard for them. I turn now to my final measure to back British business, Mr. Speaker. As I said, since 2010, we have seen the second highest growth in investment of any G7 country. However, if we're to raise productivity, we need to increase business investment further. In 2021, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, introduced the super deduction for large businesses to further stimulate business investment. And this spring, I introduced full expensing for 3 years. This means that for every £1 million a company invests, they get £250,000 off their tax bill in the very same year. The CBI, Make UK, the BCC, Energy UK and 200 other business leaders from companies including BT Openreach, Siemens and Bosch have said that making this measure permanent would be the single most transformational thing I could do for for business investment and growth. The Centre for Policy Studies say it would maximise business investment, boost productivity and deliver higher levels of GDP. But because it costs £11 billion a year, I made clear that I would only do so when it was affordable. Well, with inflation halved, borrowing down and debt falling, today I deliver on that promise. I will today make full expensing permanent. That is the largest business tax cut in modern British history. It means we have not just the lowest headline corporation tax rate in the G7, but its most generous capital allowances. The OBR say this will increase annual investment by around £3 billion a year and a total of £14 billion over the forecast period. We know on this side of the House the way to back British business is not to borrow more or subsidise more, but to increase the incentives to invest. And we do that today by introducing one of the most generous tax reliefs anywhere in the world, a huge boost to British competitiveness in an autumn statement for growth. Skills, planning, infrastructure reform, pension fund reform, support for innovation industries, levelling up, backing small businesses, and full expensing. Under Labour, business investment was 9.3% of GDP in real terms. Since 2010, it's been 9.8% of GDP. But today we go further because taken together, the overall impact of today's growth measures will be to increase business investment in the UK economy by around £20 billion a year within the decade, nearly 1% of GDP at today's level. This is the biggest ever boost for business investment in modern times, a decisive step towards closing the productivity gap with other major economies, and the most effective way we can raise wages and living standards for every family in the country. Now, as well as backing business, Conservatives know you need to back the people without whose effort no business can succeed. The entrepreneur taking risks, the builder working weekends, the nurse working nights, and the job seeker leaving benefits behind. I therefore conclude with 3 further supply-side reforms designed to improve the incentives to work in a modern, dynamic economy. And I begin with welfare, and I want to start by thanking the outstanding Work and Pensions Secretary for his help in developing these reforms. He builds on the work of my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, who introduced universal credit. Those reforms helped reduce unemployment, which has fallen by over 1 million, but to their shame, the party opposite voted against them 30 times. Because they think compassion is about giving money, we think it's about giving opportunity. But post-pandemic, we still have over 7 million adults of working age, excluding students, who are not working, despite 1 million vacancies in the economy. Many can and want to work, but our system makes that too hard. In the spring budget, I announced 30 hours of free childcare for working parents of 1 to 2-year-olds. That plan, still opposed by the party opposite, starts rolling out in April. It will help tens of thousands of parents return to work without having to worry about damaging their career prospects. Today we focus on helping those with sickness or disability and the long-term unemployed. Every year we sign off over 100,000 people onto benefits with no requirement to look for work because of sickness or disability. That waste of potential is wrong economically and wrong morally. So with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, last week I announced our Back to Work plan. We will reform the fit note process so that treatment rather than time off becomes the default. We'll reform the work capability assessment to reflect greater flexibility and availability of home working after the pandemic. And we'll spend £1.3 billion over the next 5 years to help nearly 700,000 people with health conditions find jobs. Over 180,000 more people will be helped through the Universal Support Programme, and nearly 500,000 more people will be offered treatment for mental health conditions and employment support. Over the forecast period, the OBR judge these measures will more than halve the flow of people who are signed off work with no work search requirements. At the same time, we'll provide a further £1.3 billion of funding to offer extra help to the 300,000 people who've been unemployed for over a year without any sickness or disability. But we will ask for something in return. If after 18 months of intensive support, job seekers have not found a job, we'll roll out a programme requiring them to take part in mandatory work placement to increase their skills and improve their employability. And if they choose not to engage with the work search process for 6 months, we will close their case and stop their benefits. Taken together with the labour supply measures I announced in the spring, the OBR say we will increase the number of people in work by around 200,000 at the end of the forecast period, permanently increasing the size of the economy. Now, I know that some on the benches opposite would prefer to fill those vacancies in a different way. They hanker after a more liberal immigration regime, or even dream of bringing back free movement. But Conservatives say we should unlock the potential we have right here at home. And we do that with the biggest set of welfare reforms in a decade in today's autumn statement for growth. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we're to incentivise work, we must also tackle low pay. People who get up early, put in the hours and work hard for their families deserve to be paid fairly. Since 2010, those on the minimum wage, now the national living wage, have seen their hourly wage go up from £5.80 an hour to £10.42 an hour. That's a real terms increase of more than 20%. Because we've also doubled the threshold at which you pay tax or national insurance, their after-tax income has gone up not by 20%, but by 25% more than any other income group. Today, I confirm we'll go further and accept the Low Pay Commission recommendation to increase the national living wage by 9.8% to £11.44 an hour. That is the largest ever cash increase in the national living wage, worth up to £1,800 for a full-time worker. And since the national living wage has been introduced, the proportion of people on low pay, defined as earning less than two-thirds of national median hourly income, has halved. But at the new rate of £11.44 an hour, it delivers our manifesto commitment to eliminate low pay altogether. That means by next year, someone working full-time on the national living wage will see their real take-home after-tax pay go up not by 25%, but by 30% compared to 2010. And that is the difference. The party opposite tried to reduce poverty by tinkering with benefits and tax credits. They wanted to move people from just below the poverty line to just above it. But Conservatives know the best way to tackle poverty is through work. By reforming the welfare system, reducing workless households and tackling low pay, we have helped lift 1.7 million people out of absolute poverty since 2010, because a central part of our plan for growth is to make work pay. And so, Mr. Speaker, to the final supply-side measure in today's autumn statement for growth. Because of the difficult decisions that we've taken in the last year, today's OBR forecast shows that borrowing will be lower than forecast in the spring. Debt as a proportion of GDP will be lower than forecast in the spring. Inflation will continue to fall, and our fiscal headroom has doubled. I said I would cut taxes when we could, but only responsibly and only in a way that did not fuel inflation. The OBR today confirm I can deliver a package which does that. For businesses, I've today delivered the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, with the most competitive investment allowances of any large economy. For the self-employed, I've simplified and reformed their taxes by abolishing the compulsory Class 2 charge and cutting Class 4 national insurance. but high employment taxes on 27 million people working in the public and private sectors also disincentivise the hard work we should be encouraging. On top of income tax at 20%, they pay 12% national insurance on earnings between $12,570 and $50,270. That is a 32% marginal tax rate. If we want people to get up early in the morning, if we want them to work nights, if we want an economy where people go the extra mile and work hard, then we need to recognise that their hard work benefits us all. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to cut the main 12% rate of employee national insurance. If I cut it by 1 percentage point to 11%, that would be an extra £225 in the pockets of the average worker every year. But instead, I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%. That change will help 27 million people. It means someone on the average salary of £35,000 will save over £450. For the average nurse, it's a saving of £520. For the typical police officer, a saving of £630 every single year. And, Mr. Speaker, I would normally bring in a measure like this from the start of the new tax year in April. But instead, tomorrow, I'm introducing urgent legislation to bring it in from January the 6th. So people can see the benefit in their payslips at the start of the new year. The OBR say reducing a tax on work means more people in work. And they say today's measures will, just on national insurance, will lead to the equivalent of 94,000 full-time employees in our economy, because lower tax means higher growth. And that is the difference between this side and that one. In 13 years, Labour raised taxes in every single budget, but Conservatives cut taxes when we responsibly can. And today we do just that. We cut taxes to help bigger businesses invest. We cut taxes to help smaller businesses grow. We cut taxes for the self-employed who keep our country running. And from January, we cut taxes for 27 million working people whose hard work drives our economy forward. Mr. Speaker, the best universities, the cleverest scientists, the smartest entrepreneurs have given us Europe's most innovative economy. But we can be the most prosperous too. In the face of global challenges, we've halved inflation, reduced our debt and grown our economy. As a country, we're sticking to a plan that's working, and this autumn statement for growth will attract £20 billion additional business investment a year in the next decade, bring tens of thousands of people into work and support our fastest-growing industries in a package which leaves borrowing lower, debts lower and keeps inflation falling. We are delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the largest ever cut to employee and self-employed national insurance, and the biggest package of tax cuts to be implemented since the 1980s, an autumn statement for a country that has turned a corner, an autumn statement for growth, which I commend to the House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Chancellor has lifted the lid on 13 years of economic failure. We were told that this was to be an autumn statement for growth, but the economy is now forecast to be £40 billion smaller by 2027 than the Chancellor said back in March. Growth revised down. Next year, the year after, and the year after that too. The Chancellor claims that the economy has turned a corner, yet the truth is that under the Conservatives, growth has hit a dead end. What has been laid bare today is the full scale of the damage that this government has done to our economy over 13 years. And nothing that has been announced today will remotely compensate. Mortgages rising, taxes eating into wages, inflation high with prices still going up in the shops, public services on their knees, and too many families struggling to make ends meet. As the sun begins to set on this divided, out of touch, weak government, the only conclusion that the British people will reach is this: after 13 years of Conservatives, the economy is simply not working, and despite all the promises today, working people are still worse off. Mr. Speaker, the centrepiece of today's autumn statement is a cut in the headline rate of national insurance. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm old enough to remember when the Prime Minister wanted to put up national insurance. As recently as January last year, he said, and I quote, "We must go ahead with the increase in the health and care levy. It is progressive in that the burden falls most on those who can most afford it." Utter nonsense. It was a tax on working people, and we opposed it for that very reason. Yet again, the Prime Minister is left arguing against himself. In response to last year's autumn statement, I warned that the government was pickpocketing working people through stealth taxes. I have long argued that taxes on working people are too high. Indeed, I said in my conference speech that I want them to be lower. From their failure to uprate income tax or national insurance bans, to forcing councils to raise council tax, the Conservatives have pushed the costs of their failure onto others. But the British people won't be taken for fools. They know that what has been announced today owes more to the cynicism of a party desperate to cling onto power than the real priorities of this high-tax, low-growth Conservative government. So I think that we can forgive taxpayers for not celebrating when they see the truth behind today's announcements. Going into this statement, the government had already put in place tax increases worth the equivalent of a 10p increase in national insurance. So today's 2p cut will not remotely compensate for the tax increases already put in place by this Conservative government. The fact is that taxes will be higher at the next election than they were at the last. This is the legacy of the Conservatives, and that, Mr. Speaker, is their record. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor and Prime Minister have spent the last 2 weeks marching their MPs up a hill, only to march them down again on inheritance tax. Now, let's not forget, when they realised that they had money to spend...
Kearns, I've had you chirping all the way through. Either go and get yourself that cup of tea or be quiet. Rachel Rees.
When they realised that they had money to spend, this government's first instinct was a tax cut for millionaires. But in the end, even they realised that they couldn't get away with it in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So can the Chancellor tell the House today, is cutting inheritance tax a decision delayed or a decision abandoned? This autumn statement for growth is now the 11th Conservative economic growth plan, from the 5th Prime Minister, the 7th Chancellor and the 9th Business Secretary. And what do those numbers add up to? According to the most recent GDP data, a big, fat zero. That's zero growth in the most recent data in the third quarter of this year. Now, the Chancellor mentioned some countries that we are outperforming in growth, but I couldn't help notice that he failed to mention any of the many advanced economies that have grown faster than the UK. Over the last 13 years of this low-growth Conservative government, the UK languishes in the bottom third of OECD countries when it comes to growth. There are 27 OECD economies that have grown faster than us in the 13 years since 2010, including the US, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Slovenia and 22 others. In fact, over the next 2 years, no fewer than 177 economies are forecast by the IMF to grow faster.
Sorry.
Don't bother me, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, it bothers me. I'm not being funny. I expect the same courtesies to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Those who wish to not give that courtesy, please go and find something else to do, because my constituents are interested, yours aren't. Rachel Williams.
And next year, Mr Speaker, we are forecast to be the slowest growing economy in the whole of the G7. When it comes to economic growth, under the Tories, we are more world-following than world-beating. And let's look at how their record on growth compares to Labour's record on growth. Under the Conservatives, GDP growth has averaged 1.5% per year. But with Labour, it grew an average of 2% a year in the 13 years that we were last in office. Had the economy continued to grow at the rate it did with Labour, it would now be £150 billion bigger. So what is this government's economic record? Lower growth and higher borrowing, with debt more than doubling, now at almost 100% of GDP. This is a product of their failures over 13 years. A Tory government that has failed on growth, failed on debt, failed on levelling up and failed on the cost of living too. And now they expect the British people to believe that when they say they are going to turn it all around, when it is them that is the problem and not the solution. Mr Speaker, if we are going to grow the economy, we must get more people into work. Let me be clear. People who can work should work. That's why we've long argued that the work capability assessment needs replacing. Because right now it is discouraging people from seeking work. But there's a wider problem that, yet again, this government is failing to face up to. Britain is the only country in the G7 where the employment rate still has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, with the increase in the number of people out of the workforce due to long-term health issues costing the taxpayer a staggering £15.7 billion a year. NHS waiting lists have swelled to 7.8 million, an additional 500,000 since the Prime Minister said he was going to cut them. And 2.6 million people are out of work due to long-term sickness. A healthy nation is critical to a healthy economy. That's why Labour has pledged to cut hospital waiting lists, investing an additional £1.1 billion a year to deliver 2 million more appointments, scans and operations. It will be funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status and replacing it with a modern scheme for people who are genuinely living in the UK for short periods. But once again, we see that this policy has been vetoed by the Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, the best way to get people back to work is to get our NHS working, but the reality is you can never trust the Tories with our NHS. Now, the Chancellor has made a great fanfare about public sector efficiency and value for money. This is from a government that has blown £140 million on a discredited Rwanda scheme and yet are not able to send a single asylum seeker there. £7.2 billion money lost on fraud during the pandemic, all those cheques signed up by the former Chancellor, the current Prime Minister. £8.7 billion on PPE that's been written off. HS2 costing £57 billion with not a single piece of track going north of Birmingham. No one can trust the Tories with taxpayers' money. And it says it all that after 13 years of Tory government, there are still nearly 12,000 NHS computers running on outdated software that's vulnerable to cyber attacks. 10 years ago, when he was Health Secretary, the now Chancellor promised a paperless NHS by 2018. Yet today, in 2023, 26 NHS trusts are still using fax machines. Now, why on earth should people who experience deteriorating public services under this Conservative government trust them to fix it, when his 6 years as Health Secretary makes him one of the biggest architects of failure? If you put your hands into people's pockets and take money out of them, and they don't see visible improvements in the services that they receive, they get very angry indeed. Not my words, the Chancellor's words 2 years ago. And I agree with him. The Tories have had 13 years to improve public services, and they have failed. Mr. Speaker, this is too little and too late. Yeah. I do want to welcome the Chancellor's announcement today of additional funding to tackle anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to keep our communities safe, as well as the additional money for the Holocaust Educational Trust. There is no place for hate in our society, and I know that across the House we will work together to eliminate it. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor calls this an autumn statement for growth, but it is Labour who has led the agenda on growth. And today we see the Conservatives have released their own poor cover version of what we have already announced. The Chancellor today is talking about unlocking capital by reforming pensions. But Labour would go further, encouraging investment into British start-up firms and scale-up firms, and introducing measures to ensure the consolidation of pension funds, so that our pension system gets better returns for savers and for the UK economy. On planning, the Conservatives are following Labour's lead on providing money off bills for communities that host grid infrastructure and speeding up planning decisions. What's taken them so long? Labour will get Britain building again, with a once-in-a-generation set of reforms to accelerate the building of our country's national infrastructure and to build housing too. We will fast-track battery factories, our life sciences and 5G technology to grow our economy and provide good jobs in every part of our country. And we welcome the fact that the Chancellor has announced that he will make full expensing permanent, another thing that we have been calling for. But that doesn't make up for the years of uncertainty that businesses have faced, with taxes going up and down like a yo-yo. With small and medium businesses who play such a pivotal role in growing our economy, left exposed to the Tories' economic volatility. Labour's partnership with business will get our economy firing on all cylinders. That's why this week we established a new British Infrastructure Council with key investors in the UK economy, focused on unlocking private investment by addressing the delivery challenges businesses face when investing in Britain. Through Labour's new National Wealth Fund, we will work alongside the private sector to back the growth of British industries so that we can make the crucial transition to a zero-carbon economy. And for every pound of public investment, we will leverage in 3 times as much private investment, whilst also getting a return to taxpayers. Labour's plan will boost our economy, get debt falling and make working people better off. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you listen to the benches opposite, you would believe that the cost of living crisis was behind us. But inflation is still double the Bank of England's target rate. I know the importance of low and stable inflation from my time as an economist at the Bank of England. Now, it is of course welcome that the Chancellor has accepted this year's recommendations from the Low Pay Commission that we set up on the minimum wage. But the reality is, of the Conservatives' record, that average wages for working people have been held back. Under this government, real average weekly wages have increased by just 3% in 13 years, compared to a 27% increase under the last Labour government, worth an additional £120 more every week for someone going out to work every day. And today, Mr. Speaker, is Equal Pay Day. So it is also important to recognise that the living standards of working women have also been held back by a gender pay gap that I am determined to close. Now, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister say that the cost of living crisis is dealt with. Now, everything might look a little bit better 10,000 feet up in your helicopter. But down here on planet Earth, people are approaching Christmas and the year ahead with worry and trepidation. The cost of living crisis has hit us harder because Tory mismanagement has left us so exposed. 11 million UK households don't have enough savings to cover 3 weeks of living expenses if they needed it. Working families have been skating on thin ice for too long. And as their resilience has been eroded, so has our national economies. Let's not forget, it was this government that oversaw the closure of our critical gas storage facilities, which left our country more exposed to the huge fluctuations in international energy markets. While the former Prime Minister, that's 4 Prime Ministers ago, cut energy efficiency programmes leading to higher bills for homeowners. And just last year, we saw the true cost of the Conservatives when their kamikaze budget crashed the economy, leading to market turmoil, pensions put in peril and a spike in interest rates. 1.6 million families will see their mortgage deals end this year. Those remortgaging since July have seen their payments rocket by an average of £220 a month. And next year, 1.5 million families will face a similar fate. The Conservatives' economic recklessness inflicted a Tory mortgage penalty on families across the country. In Wellingborough, families with a mortgage will be expected to find an additional £190 every single month. In Richmond, North Yorkshire, homeowners face £200 more a month on their mortgage. And in the Chancellor's own constituency, but maybe not for long, families with a mortgage will see an average increase of £420 a month because of this Conservative government's economic failure. And with increased costs for landlords, and the Chancellor knows something about that as well, renters are paying a high price too. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, working people just don't have this sort of money lying around. But this is what we've come to after 13 years of Conservative government. And this is the record upon which people will judge the Conservatives at the next election. This Tory economic recklessness is not a thing of the past. The British people are still paying the price. And we say never again. Last week, Labour put forward an amendment to the King's Speech to put our fiscal lock into law. It would prevent a repeat of last year's economic horror show. And yet the Tories voted against it. It is clear that today Labour is the party of economic and fiscal responsibility. And what have the Conservatives learnt? The Conservatives have learnt absolutely nothing. Mr. Speaker, the country is crying out for change. A decaying government can change its personnel, but they have failed to change the direction of our country. In 13 years, we've had 7 chancellors. You wouldn't run a business like this. And you can't run a country like it either. And the Prime Minister can't even promise that this chancellor will be in place at the next election. Now, we've all heard the reports. When they first came together, it was the fairy tale marriage. But 1 year on, the relationship has hit the rocks. The pair have grown apart, with rumours running rife that the Prime Minister already has his eyes on someone else. But whoever this Prime Minister picks as the Chancellor, the truth is this: Britain is and will be worse off under the Conservatives. They have held back growth. They have crashed our economy, increased debt, trashed our public services, left businesses out in the cold and made life harder for working people. Our country cannot afford 5 more years of the Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, the Ravens are leaving the tower when even Saatchi and Saatchi are saying the Tories are not working. And the questions that people will be asking at the next election and after today's autumn statement are simple. Do me and my family feel better off after 13 years of Conservative government? No. Do our schools, our hospitals, our police, do they work better after 13 years of Conservative government? In fact, does anything in Britain work better today than when the Conservatives came into office 13 years ago? We all know that working people are worse off under the Conservatives, with growth down, mortgages up, prices up, taxes up, debt up, and, Mr. Speaker, their time is up. It is time for change, a changed Labour Party to lead Britain and to make working people better off.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, indeed. And I'm afraid the Shadow Chancellor has shown once again that Labour has nothing credible to say on the economy. She tells the papers this morning that she will accept these measures, as you would expect from a copy and paste Shadow Chancellor. And can I say, in all sincerity, that I particularly welcome her conversion to supporting full expensing, which she actually voted against in this House. That is copying and pasting in the national interest, and we welcome it on this side of the House. She compared growth rates under Labour and the Conservatives, but she carefully omitted one fact. Labour inherited a golden legacy from the Conservatives and then proceeded to trash the economy before handing it over. And when it comes to growth, she didn't like it when I reminded her that we have grown faster under the Conservatives than any other major European economy. And she says that she is now converted to Conservative supply-side reforms on welfare. So I look forward to her voting with us on the lobbies on those. But her main policies are not supply-side. It is a demand-side boost to growth by increasing borrowing by £28 billion a year with absolutely no plans to repay it. Now, the Shadow Chief Secretary, who doesn't appear to be in his place, this morning he asked for more action on inflation. Well, the first thing Labour could do is drop their damaging inflationary plan to ramp borrowing up. Now, she talked about the NHS. And despite the fact that we've had more doctors, more nurses, we've had more patients treated in good or outstanding hospitals, again, what she didn't mention is the only place in Britain that NHS funding has been cut is Wales. Not once, but twice, with the longest hospital waits in Britain. And perhaps we should talk about what's happened after 13 years when we repaired Labour's damage. Unemployment down, poverty down, crime down, low pay down, schools funding up, NHS funding up, jobs up, growth up, because Conservatives know that lower tax is the path to higher growth, and today we make a start.
We don't need any shouting, thank you very much. Before I call the Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee to ask her question, I just want to make it clear to the House, because there is some confusion, that this is not the procedure that we use for a budget. This is the autumn statement. It is therefore a statement. So the point that we're at right now is the taking of questions to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Once that has concluded, then we will go on to the debate, which is speeches. So I know that I have a list of people who want to make speeches. There will be some overlap. I'm just paying attention to that. Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and what a difference a year makes. We have seen a reduction in the rate of inflation from this time last year, 11.1%, down to 4.6% this month. And we heard yesterday from the Governor of the Bank of England that he is expecting inflation to return to their target over the course of the next year or so. I was interested to hear that there are 110 measures in the announcements today that will drive growth in the UK economy. I welcome the fact that the Office for Budget Responsibility is now forecasting that this year we will see growth in the UK economy, in contrast to their forecast this time last year of a recession. And the committee looks forward to examining those 110 growth measures in detail next week, when we hear from both the Office for Budget Responsibility and from the Chancellor himself. But for my question, may I ask the Chancellor if he could tell the House overall how much his measures will improve growth and how much they have helped drive down inflation over the course of next year?
Chancellor.
Well, I thank my honourable friend who speaks very wisely about the economy from her position chairing the Treasury Select Committee. So the OBR are very specific about that. They say that the measures that I take today will permanently increase GDP by 0.3%. The measures I took in the spring budget will permanently increase GDP by 0.2%. So taken together, those measures will increase GDP by 0.5%.
SNP spokesman Drew Hendrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Chancellor for advance sight of his redactions? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor wants you to think he's pulled a rabbit out of the hat today, but actually all he's done is pulled the wool over many people's eyes. Things are still getting worse for people. Inflation is still more than double the target that it should be, and that means prices and costs for people in their homes are still going up day by day. The cost of living still goes on, and people need help now. The economy, far from the cry from the Chancellor, is stagnating. It is not growing at the moment by anything more than a sliver of a percentage just now, and that is on his watch. The Chancellor in this statement is trying to take credit for things that he should be doing anyway, that they promised to do, or indeed things that they've already done and they're now taking backward steps on, which I'll come to more in a second. The energy price cap goes up tomorrow. It's scheduled to go up again in January. Costs are going to continue to increase for people. So when welcoming some of the small measures, like the issues, the things around the support for veterans, the National Insurance Class 2 abolition, and indeed one of the significant measures for business in terms of the full expensing and making that permanent, the rest of this really doesn't bear the kind of scrutiny that I hope it will get from the proper analysts over the next few days. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, the burden is still high for people. The tax burden in the UK is still the highest it's been in 7 years. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have pointed out that tax is higher than 3 years ago, even after these measures from the Chancellor today. In reality, they don't go nearly far enough to cover the cost of living crisis faced by people across the nations of the UK. People who are struggling with mortgages and rents, with food bills, with energy bills. Now, we asked for mortgage interest tax relief to help those seeing their monthly bills go up, and for measures to help renters. Why has he ignored those people struggling? On food bills, we asked for action to help people struggling to pay their bills at the checkout, to work like, for example, France, Canada and Greece, to reduce the cost for people. Why has he chosen not to intervene on food and help those people? We asked for a range of measures to help people this winter who will be facing even higher bills than last year, such as the £400 energy bill rebate, a lower price cap, a social tariff for people. Why has he chosen not to help those people who will not be able to afford to heat their homes this coming winter? So, will he at least rule out the planned increase in the cap in January? We asked for him to commit to increasing working age benefits in line with inflation next year. Will he commit to doing that? But once again, he's chosen to punish the most vulnerable with these welfare changes. The nasty party is back in business for good. Not supporting people is a choice, and we all know what that choice is for this government. This government is on the record as working to the principle of let people die. We wanted to hear about VAT cuts for tourism and hospitality, about how to get skilled workers now to fill our vacancies, but he's chosen to ignore these stresses on our sectors. We've asked him to lay off the Scotch whisky industry, and it's good that he's frozen the duty, but there's an enormous pause for this one. He's frozen it at the rate he's already increased at it. So the Scotch whisky industry is still paying 75% in tax under this Tory UK government. Isn't it funny? Isn't it funny how Scotland is always told it's too poor until they need to raise money from our exports and natural resources, and then miraculously riches are found. We asked them to invest in net zero, and he's made some announcements today. But again, when you work down all of his green investment plans and what he calls green energy, I think we'll find that most of that money will go into nuclear. The white elephant of the energy sector just now. It is an absolute, as my honourable friend says, a shambles. We asked them to match the £500 million Energy Transition Fund for the North East of Scotland. He's chosen to ignore that. He's chosen to ignore these opportunities, highlighting again why we need the full powers of independence in Scotland. We asked them to deliver across the UK additional funding for public services to allow us to help councils, the NHS and more, and he's chosen to ignore that call. As I said, he's chosen not to help people who are struggling with the cost of living crisis. He could have helped mortgage and rent payers. He could have helped those struggling to pay for food. He could have helped those with their energy bills. In the SNP, our values lead us to want to alleviate policy and strive to get rid of it altogether. We seek measures now and in the future to help people, and we are acting now, freezing the council tax, investing in childcare, saying no to tuition fees. We're using the limited powers to mitigate this nasty Tory government's cruel policies from this place, like the rate clause and the bedroom tax. We're keeping our water, our rail services, our NHS in public hands. We are not, like the Tories and Labour, holding the door open for private companies to rush in. We've previously stepped in where Westminster has failed to boost broadband coverage, to increase our renewables and to champion the just transition. We choose to put our people first. Those are our values, values that build a fairer, more prosperous Scotland. The Scottish Government has taken the steps it can to help alleviate the worst impacts of poverty, offering people a degree of stability through the council tax freeze and a cap on rent increases. We would do more, but the fiscal powers needed are currently in this Chancellor's hands. We would choose to help. Today he had the power to help people, to lift a finger, to right some of the wrongs of this government that he's inflicted upon them. But people aren't this government's priority. We know who goes through their priority lanes. Why is this UK government fixated on tents when they should be worried about rents? They have little to offer Scotland. Our route out the chaos that Westminster has created and the permanent austerity of the cost of living nightmare that people are having to endure. And the way out of that for us is through independence and rejoining the EU. We must have that choice.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think he prepared his comments for the autumn statement he wanted me to deliver, not the one that I actually delivered. I mean, for example, he complained about the tax burden being the highest for 7 years. But what he didn't say was that in Westminster we've taken difficult decisions and cut taxes. In Scotland, the SNP ran out of money and had to raise them. He talked about punishing the most vulnerable. And just look at the measures. He talked about renters and didn't mention that we have increased the local housing allowance, which will mean £800 of help to 1.6 million of our poorest people. He didn't mention the fact that we've increased benefits by 6.7%, that is double next year's expected inflation, increased the state pension through the triple lock by 8.5%, that's nearly 3 times next year's predicted inflation. And here's the most uncomfortable truth for the SNP. They've actually been in power in Edinburgh for longer than the Conservatives have been in power in Westminster, and yet Scottish GDP is still lower, Scottish employment is still lower, Scottish inactivity is still higher. And the reason for that is very simple. They focus on separation, we focus on growth, and I know what's better for families in Scotland who will today see us getting growth going, cutting taxes and backing Scottish business.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
The Solicitor Advice Office, covering my constituency, will be grateful that the local housing allowance has been changed. The people who supply drink and drinkers will be pleased that alcohol duty is at least being frozen, at least for the time being, which will help both drinkers and not increase inflation. I'm glad that the Chancellor has pointed out to the Shadow Chancellor that the only time Labour did really well was when they obeyed the Conservative rules in 1998 and 1990 before they let go the valves and drove the economy into a stage where when we took over, they were spending £4 for every £3 brought in revenue to the government. Can I ask the Chancellor not to respond today, but in time, to the injustice to 500,000 pensioners overseas? Anne Puckridge, born 5 years before the Chancellor's father, who served in intelligence in the Navy, the Army and the RAF during the war, retired to Calgary on a pension of £72. It's still £72 instead of £156. That's an injustice which does need attention, and I hope she will get it, and we will have proposals which we can change this bad situation.
Chancellor.
Well, can I thank the Father of House for his comments, and I will look into the issue of overseas pensioners as he requested, and if I may, I will write back to him about it, or I'm happy to talk to him about it. And can I also thank him for his comments about what happened in 1997, because then, as now, the Labour Party was trying to say that their economic policies are basically the same as the Conservatives, but the reality was quite different. And because they didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining, the recession after the financial crisis was much worse.
Dame Angela Eagle.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor didn't mention the freeze to tax thresholds in his autumn statement, which is due in the next 6 years to rake in £52 billion. Was that an omission, or is he leaving the freeze in place?
Chancellor.
Well, I've never hidden the fact that we took difficult decisions a year ago, like freezing the thresholds, in order to get borrowing under control, in order to tackle inflation. But because the economy since then has outperformed the expectations of nearly every independent body, we're able this time to reduce the tax burden, and I choose to reduce the things that boost growth.
Sir John Redwood.
I've declared my business interest. I welcome the measures in the statement to promote more investment and more growth are absolutely vital. We have lost around 800,000 self-employed since February 2020. National insurance will help a bit, but will he look again at IR35 and the way it prevents them expanding their businesses and getting contracts? And on the growth of small businesses, again, welcome measures, but the VAT threshold does act as a very strong disincentive to expand your business when you get to a certain point.
Chancellor.
Well, look, I would like to thank him. I've had extensive discussions with him in the run-up to this autumn statement, and many discussions about the self-employed. And indeed, it was partly his advocacy of the role of the self-employed that made me enthusiastic to make the national insurance changes that I was able to make. I hear what he says about IR35. We took the decision we did partly because of concerns over avoidance. I'm happy to look at that again. And when it comes to the VAT threshold, he and many other colleagues have made the same point. We do have the highest VAT threshold of any major European country and indeed of any G7 country. But there is always this issue of the cliff edge, and he's right to draw my attention to it.
Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Chancellor confirm that living standards will drop by 3% in the next year?
Chancellor.
What I can confirm to the Right Honourable Lady is that a year ago they were predicted to fall by 3.7%, and now the OBR say they will increase this year by 2.5%.
Alberto Costa.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the people of Blaby and Glenparva were listening attentively to this welcome autumn statement. They're going to the polls, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 21st of December in 2 by-elections, a county council and a ward by-election. What positive message does the Chancellor have to the residents, the businesses, the pensioners, people of working age in Blaby and Glenparva about his welcome financial statement?
Chancellor.
Well, what I'd say to the businesses in Blaby and Glenparva is that for every single small business, we have frozen business rates. We're rolling over 75% discount on business rates for every pub, restaurant and high street shop for another year, because we want to do everything to back small business, because they are the lifeblood of our communities.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This statement is a deception from the Chancellor after years of unfair tax hikes. Under this Conservative government, economic growth is flatlining and public services are on their knees. Now, this year, there are 400,000 people who are still on NHS waiting lists, having been on the NHS waiting list this time last year when the Chancellor last made his autumn statement. And these people have been cruelly let down. In that statement last year, the Chancellor said, "You don't need to choose either a strong economy or good public services." So will he look the British people in the eye and admit that he has given them neither?
Chancellor.
Well, I do think that she should be careful with her language, saying things like that. I'm very clear when it comes to growth. We have grown faster than any major European economy since 2010. Yes, whilst interest rates are higher as they need to be because we're bringing down inflation, growth is more subdued. But if you listen to, for example, the IMF, who are independent commentators, they say that when we have got inflation back down to target, we will have higher growth than France, Italy and Germany. And when it comes to the NHS, we put an extra £3.3 billion into the NHS budget in the autumn statement last year. With doctors' strikes happening for most of the period since then, it has been very difficult to make progress on waiting lists, and I hope she would address her comments to those doctors if she's going to be consistent.
Yeah. Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to speak for the first time with backbenchers for a while, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I massively welcome the budget and particularly the emphasis that the Chancellor has given to skills and the superb work that's being done by the DfE at the same time. In Herefordshire, we worry about the pollution in our River Wye. Could I ask him to consider talking further with the Secretary of State for DEFRA in order to think about whether some package may not be put in place to support the long-term improvement of that river?
Well, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his sterling work as a government minister and say to him that when it comes to pollution in the River Wye, he will know that the government has made changes requiring the water companies to do over £50 billion of investment in the years ahead, but he, like me, wants to see faster progress, and I will happily give him any support I can.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Chancellor's announcement on benefit uprating, not, as he claimed, a mark of compassion, but at least delivering the essential minimum, and I congratulate the Secretary of State on achieving that. For the last 3 years, the Household Support Fund has enabled local councils to provide a very important safety net for families facing the greatest hardship. Will there be a Household Support Fund next year?
Chancellor.
Yes, there will.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Quicker than I expected. My right honourable friend has mentioned a whole series of planning reforms that he's proposing. One of the problems that local authorities have up and down the country is a lack of planning officers to actually determine those planning applications, and it will clearly take time to train and recruit new people. One of the risks that he fulfills is of the premium service for large-scale developments. There is a risk that that will mean planning officers switch to those roles rather than determining the day-to-day planning applications. Does my right honourable friend understand that we'll need to recruit more people? Does this need legislation? And what is the time frame for him introducing these changes?
Chancellor.
Well, he asks a very important question, and I want to assure him that I've had extensive discussions with the Community Secretary to make sure that we implement these reforms in a way that doesn't lead to unintended consequences. But the most important thing is that by saying for the biggest applications they are able to have full cost recovery with respect to local councils, we can start to get more resources that mean we train up more planning officers and we avoid delays, not just for the bigger applications, but for all of them.
Abena Opongasari.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Chancellor agree that the Prime Minister was wrong last year to increase national insurance, try and increase national insurance?
Yeah. Chancellor.
What I would say to the honourable ladies, what the Prime Minister wanted to do then is what he has delivered as Prime Minister, which is find a way to deliver extra funding to the NHS. But what we as Conservatives believe is that taxing the economy more lightly will lead to higher growth, and that will mean that we can fund our public services better.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the people of the Cotswolds will welcome enormously many of the measures in this budget. But can I just go on to one subject which is dear to my heart, and that is the tourist tax. There was no mention in his excellent budget of the tourist tax. British tourists going abroad spend billions of pounds benefiting those countries, and yet we actively discourage, and figures show that we're doing so, we actively discourage high-spending tourists coming from abroad and benefiting our shops and hospitality venues.
Chancellor.
Can I reassure my right honourable friends that we want to do everything possible to make our tourism and our retail industry competitive, and we want to encourage international visitors. When we changed policy on this particular issue a year ago, it was because the cost was around £2.5 billion a year, and we didn't think we could afford to continue doing it. But we are looking again at the numbers in the light of the most recent data, and we can see what's happened to comparative shops in Paris and Milan, and we will review that and see if it is still that expensive, and I hope it isn't.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker. Many of the measures in the announcement today will have spending consequences which will apply to England and Wales. I welcome many of them because they are growth measures such as getting long-term unemployed and long-term sick into work, help for the creative industries and support for business rates. Can the Chancellor confirm that these will be subject to warranted consequential payments? And if they are, will the freeze on warranted consequential payments to Northern Ireland apply to these measures?
Chancellor.
Well, I can confirm that where they are reserved matters, there obviously wouldn't be barnet consequentials, but where they aren't, there would be. And I would also say to him that our priority in terms of funding for Northern Ireland remains the restoration and return of locally elected and accountable executive. But in the meantime, we will continue to support the province in every way we can.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Has my right honourable friend given any consideration, and has the Treasury carried out an analysis of the effect on economic policy of mistaken forecasts from the ABR?
Chancellor.
I thought my right honourable friend might ask a question of that ilk. What I